Ryan Seacrest here. When you have a busy schedule, it's important to maximize your downtime. One of the best ways to do that is by going to ChumbaCasino.com. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino games like spin slots, bingo, and solitaire that you can play for free for a chance to redeem some serious prizes. So hop on to ChumbaCasino.com now and live the Chumba life. Sponsored by Chumba Casino. No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus terms and conditions apply.
Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. In the previous episode, I started the series on Wakefield Prison by delving into its history and discussing some of its forgotten prisoners. And in the next 3 episodes, I shall cover the first of the infamous inmates of Monster Mansion. Charles Bronson has spent 50 years behind bars, acquiring a reputation for being one of Britain's most violent prisoners. With the majority of his life spent in prison, his exploits have garnered almost legendary status, with the lines between fact and fiction becoming blurred. Even his incarceration is a point of contention. There are many who believe he should be released, while others argue that he will always pose a threat to society. It seems apt to start the series with Bronson, who, as one of the longest-serving inmates in the prison system, has been incarcerated in over 120 prisons in the country, including Wakefield, where he has been multiple times since the 1970s. He is also one of a small number of inmates who has been a patient at all 3 psychiatric hospitals, Ashworth, Broadmoor and Rampton. Bronson has encountered infamous inmates, being the victim and the perpetrator of assaults, and endured the harsh conditions of solitary confinement. During his time, he has been vocal about his experiences, publishing a number of books and partaking in multiple interviews, which have revealed his larger-than-life character and grandiose manner of describing his experiences. Through his recollections we get a glimpse into life in prison, and how it has changed since he stepped foot into his first cell in 1974. As part of my research, I drew from 3 books. These were titled Behind the Bars, Broadmoor, My Journey into Hell, and his self-titled autobiography, Bronson, all of which I would recommend if you wish to learn more. Join me over the next 3 episodes as we take a look into the life of Charles Bronson, what has led to his years of incarceration, his experiences, and by the end of these episodes I would love to hear your thoughts on whether he should or should not be released. According to the man himself, Charles Bronson didn't exist until 1987, when he was given the name by boxing promoter Paul Edmonds. Prior to this, he was Michael Gordon Peterson, and I shall refer to him as such throughout the first 2 episodes. Born on the 6th of December 1952 to Ira and Joe, Michael was described by his aunt, Eileen Perry, as a lovely lad. He was obviously bright and always good with children. He was gentle and mild-mannered, never a bully. He would defend the weak. Michael was one of 4 children, although his younger sister did not live past infancy. He was close to his brother John, who was just 19 months older than him, whereas he did not have such a bond with his younger brother Mark, due to their 8-year age gap. The Peterson family were well respected. His father Joe had been an aircraft mechanic in the Second World War, becoming a Royal Navy boxing champion, and in 1949, 25-year-old Joe married Ira, an 18-year-old Welsh girl. When she was 8, Ira's family had moved to the Bedfordshire town of Luton, roughly 30 miles north of London, and it was here she would continue her married life with Joe, who, after leaving the Navy, took up work as a decorator. The couple moved into a 3-bedroom semi-detached house on the Rumfold estate, and shortly after their union they welcomed their first child, John, followed almost 2 years later by the birth of Michael. The boys were raised by their parents to be respectful and disciplined, with Joe being a father who exerted his authority without resorting to violence, while their mother ensured they ate well, were smartly dressed, and well-mannered. The family home was immaculate, with Ira tending to the inside while her husband took great pride in maintaining a beautiful garden. In all, Michael's formative years were stable and loving, yet when he was roughly 6 years old, he would experience something that would continue to haunt him. The youngster had been out playing with some children in the neighbourhood, when a trio of teenage boys lured the group into a woodland located just behind Michael's home. The older boys began to interfere with some of the girls, encouraging the other children to watch, but Michael became distraught and began to lash out. Screaming and crying, he ran home to tell his mother what he had witnessed. The culprits were apprehended and sent to Bristol, but the memory of their actions remained with Michael for years to come. It may have been the source of his deep-rooted disdain for sex offenders. 2 years later, Ira was preparing tea, when Michael became a bit too boisterous. As he raced past her, she turned to reprimand him, with the 8-year-old running into a glass sauce bottle she was holding. It is not certain the full extent of his injuries, and despite connections being made between head injuries and possible changes in personality, in Bronson's case, psychiatrists believe that this early head injury likely had no effect on the man he became. In the same year this injury occurred, Michael's brother, Mark, was born in the family home. Despite this joyous event, his abiding memory is his mother's cries of pain, with the 8-year-old becoming upset and unable to fully comprehend what was happening. While Ira's days were focused on caring for the newborn, John and Michael were attending school, where the differences between the two siblings became increasingly apparent. John, the older of the two, was outgoing, enjoyed team sports, and loved to learn, whereas Michael was shy and not academically minded, and preferred to work alone. At home, Michael was a quiet and loving child, but he was also plagued with nightmares, was afraid of the dark, and had poor bladder control. This may have added to his reserved nature. One thing that did bring him joy was his love of animals. His family owned dogs and budgies, and at the age of 10 he created his own mini zoo, catching creatures such as mice and frogs, which he would house in the garden shed, and charge the neighbourhood children money to view. In all, there was nothing in his formative years that psychiatrists would identify as an indicator of the path his life would take. Even Michael admitted in his book, titled Bronson, that, quote, "I can't blame my upbringing for what I have become. Maybe I was a bit more headstrong than some lads, maybe a little more quick-tempered and rebellious." It was only in his teenage years that this quick-tempered and rebellious aspect of his personality became apparent, changing from a kind and obedient child to a petty thief with violent and disruptive tendencies. This could have been due to many factors, including puberty, changes in environment, and the influence of peers. One of the earliest signs of his violent and self-destructive nature occurred at the age of 13, when he experienced his first urge to kill. He recalled waiting behind a tree with a glass bottle for a potential victim to walk by. However, as time passed, his frustration built to the point where he turned his pent-up urge to harm someone else into a self-inflicted injury by hitting himself repeatedly over the head with the bottle until he bled. Alongside this disturbing incident, Michael would become acquainted with 4 boys who would cause him to end up on the wrong side of the law. Every Saturday, he and his new group of friends would head into town with the intention of stealing. They would acquire pens, diaries, boot polish, and other miscellaneous items, which they would then conceal in a shed and then sell on. It all came to a head when one of the group was caught by a store security guard, and during questioning he told the police who his accomplices were and where they hid the stolen goods. For his parents, Michael's actions were unimaginable. They had raised him to be a respectful and law-abiding individual. Fortunately, the juvenile court showed leniency, with Michael being ordered to go to an attendance centre every Saturday for 12 weeks. This first experience with the law taught Michael 2 things. He hated places that enforced discipline, and that having someone betray your trust was hurtful. This may have been the start of his resentment towards grasses that would only grow while he was in prison. Around this same time, his older brother John would start to follow in their father's footsteps, when he joined the Royal Marine Band. In doing so, he moved out of the family home to continue his education. Seeing his eldest son dressed in his uniform filled Joe with pride. Michael knew that he could not take after his brother whom he idolised, but would not be able to replicate, as unlike John he couldn't handle being shouted at and hated regimentation. So while his brother pursued a naval career, Michael's life began to head down a less respectable path. He had been attending a school for boys which suited his reserved character, but when the decision was made to change it to a mixed-gender facility, it increased his introverted nature. Even when he got his first girlfriend, he was often overcome with shyness and embarrassment. His discomfort at school led to him playing truant, and when Michael did attend he became disruptive, with his quick temper occasionally leading to fights. His behaviour caused him to be expelled from multiple schools, adding to his parents' despair. His mother Ira stated in the real Bronson documentary that on one occasion he was suspended because he had hit a teacher, yet she went on to state that she could not recall if this was accurate. Michael would also start demonstrating a seeming disregard for the fact that actions often had consequences, participating in risky behaviours such as stealing motor vehicles and taking them for a joyride. He would exceed the speed limit just for the thrill of it. At the age of 15, with just months of his formal education remaining, Michael continued to truant from school. Struggling to find a direction for his life and missing his brother, he decided to run away from home, hitchhiking to Deal in Kent, where John was stationed. Once he arrived, he was happy to see his brother, who was smartly attired in his uniform. Michael was encouraged by his older sibling to go home, but the visit to the base solidified that he did not want to follow his father and brother into the armed forces. Returning home, Michael officially finished his schooling, and a week later he started working at Tesco's supermarket, replenishing and pricing stock. But his new role made him feel uncomfortable. He didn't feel like it was a man's job, although it did lead to him forming a relationship with a girl whose name he would have tattooed on his body. This impulsive expression of love would become a permanent reminder of a short-lived romance. His time at the supermarket did not last long either. He had issues with his boss, becoming increasingly agitated by how he was spoken to. And just 2 weeks into his employment, on the busy Friday night, his manager chastised him for not keeping the eggs stocked while customers were present. Michael, who hated being told off in front of others, already felt humiliated, but snapped when his boss approached him in the stockroom to discipline him again. He lashed out and punched the man, knocking him to the floor. Michael was promptly escorted from the premises by security and dismissed from his job, but on this occasion no charges were brought against him. Finding himself jobless and without purpose, 15-year-old Michael and a friend decided to leave home and hitchhike around the country. They travelled to Elmsmere Port, where Michael's maternal grandparents lived. But they didn't stay long. Instead, the two friends took a ferry across to Dublin and then hitched lifts to Belfast. Yet shortly after arriving in the city, they were picked up by the police, who questioned them, and although not charged with any crime, the pair thought it best to head home, where Michael's disappointed and angry father was waiting for him. Perhaps in an effort to help get his son on the right track, his father helped Michael secure work as a builder's labourer in Luton, a role he enjoyed as it paid well and enabled him to embrace his masculinity. Yet despite liking the job, a co-worker made it difficult, going out of their way to antagonise Michael, undoing tasks that he had spent hours working on. On this occasion, Michael sensed that his anger towards the man was growing, and not wishing to retaliate, he simply stopped showing up to work. While he began hopping from job to job, he also started drinking regularly at the local bars and pubs, despite being 3 years below the legal age. He would get into fights, dated various girls, and took Purple Heart pills, the street name for phenobarbital. His behaviour reflected the actions of many teenage boys, but he was also worried at the direction some of his peers' lives were taking, with a number of his friends ending up in Borstal. Determined he did not wish to end up there, Michael decided he needed a change of scenery, opting to move to live with his maternal grandparents in Ellesmere Port, where he started working as a labourer, and a few months later his parents and younger brother Mark also moved to the town. With a steady job and family around him, Michael attempted to get his life in order and built a new social circle. By the age of 16 he had formed a group of companions who he acknowledged in hindsight weren't true friends. He would drink excessively just to impress them, often ending up passing out on the doorstep of strangers or his own home. He was spending his wages on alcohol, buying rounds for his companions, yet when he had no money, his so-called friends would disappear. Although his employment as a plasterer did not last long, he went from job to job with ease, and had started a new relationship with a girl called Myra. In all, his new life in Elmsmere Port was looking up. He was 17 years old and seemed to be getting his life together. That was until he had an argument with Myra's father. He took his anger out on a series of parked cars, causing extensive damage, and was caught by the owners, who beat him up and restrained him until the police arrived. Charged with criminal damage, he found himself in Risley Remand Centre, where he was psychologically evaluated and placed on a wing awaiting trial. Risley was a place which had only opened 4 years prior when Michael arrived, but in the many years since his stay, the centre has witnessed riots, been found inadequate during official inspections, and has experienced a high number of suicides. One such death occurred during Michael's first stay in the facility, with the 17-year-old witnessing the boy hanging in his cell. He has come to experience a number of deaths while inside, some being close friends. These have lingered with him over the years, but he is always disconcerted by how quickly the bodies are removed, and it seems that within half an hour the prison routine carries on like nothing has happened. Although Risley was a centre for those awaiting trial, it gave him a sense of how life behind bars would be, constantly observed with strict discipline and seen as a number, not a name, residing in cramped, cold cells while visits from his loved ones were held behind toughened glass. He would quickly learn what happens when you don't follow the rules, being the subject of many beatings by guards, a pattern which would be repeated during his many years in incarceration. Fortunately for Michael, having spent 2 months in the remand centre, he would serve no prison time for vandalising the cars. Instead, he was found guilty of criminal damage, ordered to pay a fine, and given a year's probation, with him having to attend weekly meetings with a probation officer. Michael hated being in Risley, and upon his release he was adamant he would not return. Yet despite this determination, he would be no stranger to its cells, being sent there on another 5 occasions. Leaving the centre, he tried to get back on track. He got a job working for a furniture removal company and became acquainted with a group of friends his own age, yet it wouldn't last long. He continued to go out drinking, his violent outbursts getting him barred from multiple establishments, with fights erupting over incidents as small as a spilt drink or a drunken insult. Michael's new friends did not help him either, with them getting him entangled in a situation that almost cost a man his life. Accompanied by his acquaintances, they stole a lorry containing brand new sofas. With Michael behind the wheel, they headed south to Cannock in Staffordshire, where they planned to unload the goods. But their plans were scuppered when the headlights of a car appeared before them. The next thing Michael knew, the car had disappeared beneath the lorry, bringing the vehicle to an abrupt halt. His right leg struck the steering wheel. Urged on by adrenaline and his companions fleeing, he leapt from the cab. Michael's leg gave way as he struck the ground, but hearing voices approaching he limped away from the scene, until he reached a hedgerow, where he hid while emergency vehicles arrived. He watched as police scoured the area in search of the individuals who had been witnessed fleeing the lorry. Once the coast was clear, he managed to make the 90-mile journey back to his parents' home, despite his leg being badly injured. But upon his arrival, he found the police were waiting for him. As the driver of the lorry, he was arrested, charged with dangerous driving, and was placed in Risley to await his trial. He would be there for several months, until the driver of the car was confirmed to be in a stable condition and recovering. Having determined that there would be no additional charges, Michael went to trial, where the judge took into account the amount of time he had spent at Risley. He placed him on probation, ordered Michael to pay £600 in damages, and banned him from driving for life. Now on probation, he would spend evenings with his friend John, with the pair frequenting the local pubs. Michael still occasionally got into fights, yet one drinking session had the potential to give him the positive direction his life needed. Accompanied by John, Michael entered the Bull public house, where a live band were performing. The two men, dressed in their smart suits, attracted the attention of two ladies seated at the bar, with whom they began to converse. Friends Irene and Linda had gone to the pub to watch the band, but they left with the men who would become their future husbands, with Linda marrying John and Irene tying the knot with Michael, although neither relationship would last. Irene described Michael as a charmer and the perfect gentleman. He made her feel safe and treated her like a lady, going as far as insisting that others didn't swear while in her presence. It was a relationship which his mother approved of, with Ira stating that Irene was a good girl from a good family. However, Michael nearly jeopardized the relationship in its early stages, when he and a friend were stopped by police with a car full of stolen goods, and he was sent back to Risley, where he would be detained for 3 months. Fearful he was going to lose Irene, he considered trying to escape. He attempted to pick the cell lock or remove his handcuffs, but nothing worked. Upon his release, he was reunited with Irene, and the pair moved into a small flat with John and Linda. Michael became a self-employed decorator, while Irene worked as a typist. Despite the stability he had found, he still took risks. He managed to acquire a provisional license, even though he was banned from driving, and would drive around in cars that were not taxed or MOT'd. He continued to go out on a night to drink and meet girls, once again exhibiting the immature actions of a typical teenager, but he was also risking his freedom by committing burglaries. Yet once again he was given a reason to change when Irene became pregnant. Although his mother advised that they should only marry if they truly loved each other, the pair felt that marriage was the right thing to do, which was understandable given the traditional views held by many at the time regarding children out of wedlock. With the baby due in 5 months' time, the couple exchanged vows at Chester Registry Office. Yet the union was not witnessed by Irene's parents, whose father disapproved of Michael. Entering his 20s, Michael was excited about settling down with his new wife and becoming a father to a son who would share his name. Marriage also brought out a different side to Michael, who had certain expectations of his new wife. He became possessive, disapproving of other men looking at Irene, and held a traditional view on how a woman should behave, insisting that she dressed in a modest and ladylike fashion. Michael also wanted to be a good father and husband, and so after living with his parents for a short time, the couple moved into their own house and prepared for the arrival of their first child. He started to work with his dad painting bridges and other steel structures, learning how to climb them and finding that working at height was a thrilling and liberating experience, being able to see the world from a whole new perspective, not realizing that the skills he acquired he would put to use in a very different manner while in prison. Just prior to the birth of his son, Michael attended a house party where he smoked a joint and took some pills. These caused him to hallucinate before passing out. He was subsequently placed in a van and dropped off on his parents' doorstep. It would be the last time he took drugs willingly. Not only had his irresponsible actions drawn the disapproval of both his pregnant wife and his mother, but the side effects of the drugs were something he never wished to experience again. When his son, Michael Jr., was born, he proved to be a doting father and had a chance at a normal family life. They had a home, a car, and a secure income. But as the months passed, the marriage was far from happy, with the couple beginning to drift apart. They would argue, and he spent more and more time away from home, working or drinking, and unbeknownst to his wife, occasionally committing crimes. The first hint for Irene regarding Michael's nocturnal activities was when he was arrested for criminal damage after smashing a shop window, for which he would find himself back at Risley. There are contradicting reports regarding why he broke the window, with some suggesting that he had intended to steal the items in the shop, while others allege it had occurred following an argument with Irene, and he had punched the glass in frustration. When he appeared at Chester Crown Court in December 1972, Irene was there to witness proceedings. Fortunately for Michael, the judge showed leniency on account that he had a new baby, a steady employment, and he believed he deserved a chance. The judge gave Michael a 3-year suspended sentence, but within this time he would throw away the chance he was given, letting down his family and finding himself behind bars for the first time. In 1974, with his marriage deteriorating, he suffered the loss of his maternal grandfather. He started drinking excessively, spending multiple days away from home, waking up on friends' sofas and nursing horrendous hangovers, with his absence from home only adding to the strain on his relationship. By August of that year, he had become acquainted with a group of individuals who would assist in his downfall. Having acquired a shotgun and sawed off the barrel, Michael entered into what he called a week of madness. It started with Michael following a man home and assaulting him, after becoming convinced that his victim had cheated at a card game. After this, he would go on to rob a Tudor mansion. But as the week progressed, his actions escalated in both brutality and riskiness. He robbed a post office and threatened the assistant with the shotgun. And in his final act that week, he and a group of accomplices raided a petrol station, where the attendant was assaulted with the shotgun wielded by Michael, who later admitted that he came close to murdering a man that day. Having worked for a short time as a strongman in the circus, he still retained the handlebar moustache and muscular physique. This, combined with his almost 6-foot stature, already made him intimidating. Add to this the shotgun, and it must have been a terrifying experience for his victims. For all the effort that went into the raids and the terror he caused, he gained little monetarily from his crimes, for which he would pay a heavy price, primarily due to his use of a firearm, even though no shots were fired. Michael was charged with robbery, aggravated burglary, assault with intent to rob, illegal possession of a firearm, and wielding a firearm. In hindsight, he states there was no excuse for his actions, but that week of madness cost him everything: his marriage, the chance to see his son grow up, his family, and his freedom. While awaiting trial, he returned to the cockroach and rat-infested cells of Risley, where the harsh reality of what he had done began to dawn on him, especially at visiting time. These took place in individually enclosed cubicles, where the guest is separated from the prisoner via reinforced glass, preventing any physical contact. It was hard enough for Michael to see his parents like this, but he couldn't bear the thought of seeing Irene and his son without being able to touch them, being so close to his 3-year-old, yet unable to cuddle him. Therefore he made the choice to deny them visitation, opting instead to write to them. Michael started to grow resentful towards the prison system while in Risley. Not only were the conditions inhospitable, with dirty cells and guards who beat prisoners for the smallest infraction, it was that the inmates hadn't yet been convicted of any crime, but they were already being treated as though they were guilty. When his day of judgment arrived at Chester Crown Court, he took to the dock and entered a guilty plea for each of the charges against him, all witnessed by his family, including Irene and his 3-year-old son, Michael. Since the start of their marriage, Irene had been unaware of her husband's criminal activities, and as she sat in the courtroom that day, she was hearing it for the first time, learning that there was a whole other side to the man she married and shared a child with. Irene held her son tightly as the sentences were read out, with Michael ordered to serve 7 years behind bars. Throughout the proceedings, Irene had contained her emotions, but as these words were uttered they overwhelmed her, causing her to flee from the room, with her husband's eyes watching her flight. As Michael was taken below to the cells to await transportation to Walton Prison, his mother and Auntie Eileen were permitted to see him. Observing the heartbreak in their eyes, Michael reassured them that he could be out in 4 years on good behaviour, but 14 years later those words would prove hollow. Officially known as HMP Liverpool, Walton Prison would be where Michael's incarceration began. He had been there 4 years prior to visit a friend, and how he was to get a taste of what life was like on the other side of the bars. He was placed on H Block, a wing designated for long-term prisoners, some serving more than 30 years. Unlike in Risley, where it was 2 inmates to a cell, at Walton each was housed separately, with very little comforts. A steel bed frame screwed to the floor, a straw mattress, a bedpan and washbowl were the only real furnishings in an otherwise dark, damp room. Like all prisons, there was a set routine and the rules were enforced by guards. Stepping out of line had consequences, from losing privileges to being placed in the segregation block. Michael quickly learned there were 2 types of prison guard, something which would prove true throughout his time in the prison system. There were those who were decent and showed prisoners respect, which they were then given in return, while other guards seemed to think the only way to prove a point was through boots and fists, the latter being the ones who made Michael a target, especially as his notoriety as a dangerous inmate grew. It became a badge of honour to say they had taken him on. During his first 6 months at Walton, Michael couldn't help but fight back against the regime, with his body often covered in bruises, having been restrained and beaten by the guards. He had been away from his family for nearly a year when Irene brought his son to visit. For an hour the pair talked, her voice breaking as Irene pleaded with him to stop fighting back, admitting to her husband that she couldn't cope with the thought of raising their son alone, feeling like she was perpetually waiting for her life to return to normal. This visit left Michael in a highly emotional state. His anger and violent urges had begun to surface, as he felt his life outside the prison walls slipping away from him. Within hours he had taken his frustration out on another inmate, breaking their nose and ribs. The man he assaulted had been an obvious choice, as the inmate had purposely hurt his own family, having been convicted of strangling his girlfriend and assaulting his child, while all Michael wanted to do was be reunited with his own family. Within days of this incident, he would lash out again, beating up a prisoner he suspected had been a grass while they were in the shower block. During this assault, he attempted to claw out the man's eyes, with Michael later admitting that he was, quote, so far gone he was actually enjoying it. He then assaulted 2 prison officers with a stick, resulting in being restrained and taken to the punishment block. Here he was placed in a cell, where he would spend 23 hours a day, with an hour's exercise and virtually no contact with anyone other than the 7 or more guards who were assigned as his escort. The isolation cell was unheated, dirty and windowless, furnished only with a blanket, a compressed cardboard bed and a plastic bedpan. Every 30 minutes throughout the day and night, a guard would open the hatch in the door, preventing Michael from being able to properly fall asleep. This was the beginning of a vicious cycle of violence and punishment that Michael seemed unable to escape from. Each time he lashed out, more months and years were added to his sentence, with every visit to isolation being accompanied by beatings, humiliation, and a gradual descent into madness. In the book Bronson, he would reflect on the effects solitary confinement had on him, quote, isolation twists the mind. It makes normal things like daylight or the sound of people's voices appear magnified to almost blinding and deafening levels. In 1975, he would be taken from Walton in the west of England to Hull in the east, handcuffed in the back of a prison van for the entirety of the 130-mile trip. At the time, Hull was designated as a maximum security prison, located on the banks of the River Humber, and was one of the most secure facilities in the country, fitted with CCTV and 20-foot walls topped with barbed wire, beyond which were housed some of the most dangerous prisoners in the country. Alongside its state-of-the-art security systems, Hull also offered some of the best recreational facilities for the inmates, including a boxing ring, football pitch, and full-size snooker tables, and despite the potential risks some of these individuals posed to society, they were allowed privileges including access to the kitchen to prepare their own meals. Michael had not yet developed the reputation he has now, and when he was placed in A Block he was in awe of some of the inmates he was sharing the wing with, including Charlie Wilson, a former market trader who was among 17 men who carried out the 1963 Great Train Robbery, which was an audacious crime during which over £2 million was stolen from a Royal Mail train, prompting one of the largest manhunts in the UK. One of Michael's favourite aspects of Hull Prison was the view from his cell window, which overlooked Alexandra Docks and the river beyond. Through his little pane of glass he watched the cranes unloading the ships, while in the distance he could just about make out the Humber Bridge, which was under construction. But his contentment wouldn't last long. Within a week of being in the prison, he refused to work in the sewing room, as it was against his masculine nature, going as far as sabotaging the sewing machine just to get out of work. Unable to convince him otherwise, he was placed in a room alongside other inmates who either couldn't or wouldn't work. From his description, this sounded more like a reward than a punishment, with them being allowed to play board games, cards, and drink cups of tea. Despite this seemingly pleasant treatment, Michael would soon ruin it. He took offence to the manner in which one guard had been treating him and the other prisoners, with his agitation building until he exploded in a fit of rage and began to destroy the social room, throwing a table at the guards, with one being hit over the head. His outburst caused more prison officers to enter the room, but as one guard advanced towards him, Michael struck the man over the head with a broken table leg. After this, he was assailed by multiple officers, who beat him, restrained him, and then carried Michael to the punishment block, where he was forcibly stripped. He was then placed in a body belt, meaning his hands were cuffed to the waist, and another strap was placed around his ankles. With his body now fully restrained, and covered in cuts and bruises, Michael was dragged into the cell and injected with the drug Logactil, otherwise known as the liquid cosh, due to its effects of subduing an individual. This would be the first of many times the drug would be used on Michael. It rendered him unconscious, caused him to sleep for many days, usually within a windowless cell devoid of furniture. After this particular incident, he had another 6 months added to his sentence, which, in addition to the 6 months he had received from the events at Walton Jail, had extended his prison term to 8 years. This was a situation which caused more heartache for his family. With Irene and Michael Jr. visiting him in Hull, his wife once again implored him to control his temper, warning her husband that he would, quote, end up in the nut house. Unbeknownst to Michael at the time, he would not see Irene or his son again for 23 years, and his wife's words would prove prophetic, as his violent behaviour only escalated, and within 4 years he would be certified as insane. The cycle of violent outbursts, beating and solitary confinement became relentless. He was losing control and regularly took his aggression out on guards, inmates, and even the prison buildings. Aside from his notoriety for being violent, Michael would also gain infamy for his many attempts at escaping the prison confines, whether for a rooftop protest or in a bid for freedom. His first attempt would be made in Hull, when he managed to scale the 20-foot-high fencing surrounding the exercise yard and raced towards a building which was in the process of being demolished. He picked up a wooden joist, intent on using it to climb over the wall, but his plans were scuppered when the guards released the dogs. The canines started running towards him, prompting Michael to flee back towards the exercise yard. Hearing their growls and barks getting closer, he leapt upon the fence, just avoiding their jaws, but became entangled in the razor wire, which cut into his limbs. Freeing himself, he tumbled down into the exercise yard, breaking his right ankle. Once his wounds had been treated, Michael was returned to the isolation block, and earned himself an additional 6 months on his sentence. He was held in the block for 5 months, during which time he was assaulted by guards on multiple occasions. But more hurtful than the physical pain was the emotional strain caused by not hearing from Irene. It had been months since he had had any communications from her. The psychological effects of being held in isolation have long been debated, with its use seen as a barbaric practice that can have detrimental impacts on an individual's physical and mental state. Being unable to socialise with others, one becomes accustomed to being alone, and the longer the isolation, the harder it is to adapt to environments where there are people and noises. Perhaps one of the earliest signs that Michael was succumbing to the effects of isolation was during an altercation with another inmate called Henry John Gallagher, who was held in the cell above Michael's. Gallagher had a habit of being a nuisance. He would tap or bang on the floor of his cell, a sound reverberating in the room below. Becoming agitated by the noise, Michael shouted out for Gallagher to stop it, only for his upstairs neighbour to tell him to, quote, "Fuck off, you English pig." Michael sat in his isolation cell with the incessant noise, building a resentment towards Gallagher, who was like the dripping tap that can't be shut off. But Michael had no way of getting to him, and so for 6 months his irritation grew. And just 2 days after being allowed back onto the wing, his anger would boil over. He had come face to face with Gallagher, and seeing the look in the inmate's eyes and the animosity between them, Michael felt he had no option. It was a case of attack or be attacked, so he decided to strike first. Entering Gallagher's cell, Michael repeatedly hit him with a jug. Even after the man had fallen to the floor and the jug handle had broken, he continued his assault, the broken vessel cutting Gallagher's skin as Michael laughed with each blow. Initially charged with grievous bodily harm for the assault on Gallagher, he would appear at Hull Magistrates' Court, where he was convicted with unlawful wounding, with another 9 months added to his sentence. He was now looking at almost 10 years in prison. Within that time, Gallagher would be freed from prison and would murder 4 people. Yet back in 1975, Michael was the one considered to be the dangerous individual, and as such he would be transferred in a van accompanied by 7 guards to Armley Prison in Leeds, where the same number of guards were waiting to escort him to the segregation block. Once there, he was placed in a cell and ordered to remove his clothing. When he refused, the guards violently restrained and beat him, ripping off his clothes, and left him wounded and naked on the floor of the empty cell. Shortly after this, he would be visited by the prison governor, who told him that the Home Office had deemed Michael, quote, "too dangerous to mix." As such, he would remain in segregation for the duration of his stay at Armley, housed in another soulless cell where he was denied access to luxuries such as books or a radio. He was only permitted to have a shower once a week, forcing him to wash daily using the jug and basin in his cell. Alone in his room, he fought against the boredom. He had stopped writing to Irene, who had not been in contact for several months, but continued his communications with his parents. But the hours of isolation took their toll, with Michael having to fight off the negative thoughts which threatened to overwhelm him. To counter these, he began a fitness regime that he continues to carry out to this day. He performs hundreds of push-ups daily, managing to keep himself physically fit while fighting to remain mentally stable. But his violence was never too far from the surface, with him attacking a man in the shower who had grasped on another inmate. Although when asked about this incident by prison officials, he denied any involvement. Aside from his violent tendencies, Michael still clung to the idea of escaping. Despite failing to do so while in Hull, he intended to succeed in Armley, working in conjunction with a fellow inmate, Dave Anslow. The pair had been housed in adjacent cells whilst in solitary confinement, but had been allowed to converse during the 1 hour a day they spent in the exercise yard. During this time, they concocted their plan. They took their opportunity one evening after the prison had been locked down for the night, with them intending to use the steel bed frames in their respective cells as battering rams to break the hinges off the doors. Yet they had not anticipated the noise that would be generated by their actions, which drew the attention of the guards, who restrained Michael and escorted him to the strong box. This was a room that had been out of use for several years, riddled with cobwebs and dust, with a musty stench that seemed to seep from the damp cold floor onto which he was thrown upon. The guards' boots echoed as they exited, slamming the steel door behind them, eradicating the only source of light. For 7 hours, Michael lingered in this dank hole, where the air was so stale that when the door was finally opened, he rushed out, desperate to breathe. He was rewarded by being restrained once more. Made to feel like an animal that had escaped from its cage, he was cast back into the strong box, where he would linger for another 2 days. Aside from the punishment of isolation, Michael would soon be introduced to what he considered to be another form of cruelty, inflicted upon individuals the Home Office considered to be too dangerous, with these prisoners being constantly moved from one prison to the next, denying them the chance to feel settled in one place. Over the years he would find himself in this position, being transferred between prisons including Wakefield, where he was first placed in 1975, but would return numerous times over the ensuing years. As had occurred at Tarmley, he would remain in the punishment block at Wakefield under the instruction of the Home Office, because he was still seen as a high-risk prisoner. Yet he didn't do himself any favours. He was defiant when told to do the simplest things, such as refusing to get dressed prior to being escorted for his meals. His actions were becoming increasingly unpredictable and violent, with him destroying his cell and carrying out disgusting acts, including spitting in the guards' faces. Due to his adversarial attitude, he would be punished by the guards, who tormented him by banging on his cell door throughout the night. They served him cold food, denied him the basics of a clean bedpan, toilet roll or soap. This treatment only added to his growing feelings of disdain. He would remain in the segregation cell for 10 days, until the guards arrived en masse, forcing Michael into a body belt and restraining his ankles. They carried him to the prison van, where he was laid on the floor and strapped down, a position he would remain in throughout the 190-mile journey south to Wandsworth Prison in south-west London. Michael was still to be housed in the segregation block, but the treatment he received in Wandsworth was an improvement on the prior prisons, with the guards being straight-talking and respectful. Yet this didn't stop Michael from losing his temper. 2 days after he had arrived, he attacked 2 guards and bit a third, causing him to be kept in the strong box for a week, where he was kicked and punched by multiple prison guards. Yet the physical assaults paled in comparison to the pain he would feel when a brown envelope arrived containing divorce papers from Irene. With every indiscretion, Michael had been punished with time added to his sentence, lengthening his prison term, and Irene was no longer willing to keep waiting for him, although she has stated in interviews that the marriage would have ended even if he had been freed. For Michael, the papers served as a stark reminder of what he had lost, with him stating, quote, "I had thrown my whole life away, the woman I loved and the son I worshipped. I knew from that night that my life would never be normal. I lost everything, including my sanity." He would remain in Wandsworth for 10 months, primarily held in solitary. The remainder of his stay was relatively uneventful, except for an incident involving a prisoner who was held in the cell beside him. Michael saw this man as a bully, but as with John Henry Gallagher, the pair were held in isolation, denying them physical contact. Therefore their feud grew through words, with both threatening the other with violence. Yet before they could come face to face, Michael made the first move. One day he acquired some sugar, which, when his neighbour asked if he may have some, Michael obliged. However, 4 days later the prisoner was taken to hospital, having become violently ill. Unbeknownst to the inmate, Michael had laced the sugar with ground-up shards of glass, and although the prisoner suspected his involvement, there was no evidence to prove it, with Michael only admitting to the offence many years later. His actions were a sign that he was prepared to go to any length to harm those who had wronged him, and although he had tried to maintain his exercise regime, the months of solitary were causing him to unravel. There were moments and people who would momentarily help to keep him from descending into madness. In 1976, he would leave Wandsworth and be taken by ferry to Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight, a prison with a reputation for being a tough environment, with it once holding the dubious record of having the most murders committed within its walls. Michael was placed on C Wing, which had just 14 cells, and over the years has become known as the place for those deemed untreatable or too dangerous to be in Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital, which gives you an indication of how the Home Office had started to view Michael. Due to the profile of the individuals being held on C Wing, the unit was completely segregated from the rest of the prison. As such, the wing had its own library, gym and exercise yard. Over the years, Parkhurst, which Bronson has referred to as our own Devil's Island, would play a major role in shaping his future. He has formed lasting friendships there, but also garnered enemies, and was incarcerated there when some of the most brutal acts of violence were carried out, including 3 murders and at least 1 sexual assault. It was at Parkhurst, while acclimatising himself to his new surroundings, he would be visited by a man with a cup of coffee and some chocolate biscuits. To Michael's amazement, this well-mannered gentleman introduced himself as Reggie Cray, who alongside his brother Ronnie had overseen one of the most prolific gangs in London during the 1950s and 60s. Reggie excused himself, leaving Michael to enjoy the coffee and biscuits. But a few moments later he returned with a record player and inquired whether he liked music, for which Michael thanked Reggie for his kindness, only to be corrected by the man stating that he was actually Ronnie Cray, and Reggie had brought him the coffee. This encounter with the Cray twins would be the start of their friendship, with the trio finding themselves held in numerous institutions together over the years. It would be relationships like these which would help Michael cope with his ever-increasing time spent in prison. Michael also noted that the guards on C Wing had a calmer disposition when dealing with the 14 prisoners in their care, surmising that this was likely due to the volatile nature of the individuals on the unit, who may have been triggered by a word said in the wrong tone or a heavy-handed approach to being restrained. Ronnie Cray was a prime example of how dangerous the prisoners on C Wing could be, with Michael witnessing Ronnie's violent outbursts on numerous occasions. In his book detailing his experiences in Broadmoor Hospital, Bronson recalls seeing Ronnie's behaviour at Parkhurst, stating he was, quote, frothing at the mouth, eyes bulging, shaking in anger, and almost ripping someone's face off. He also recalled that one inmate required 40 stitches to his face after being attacked by Ronnie, while on another occasion, the infamous gangster lashed out at a guard just for passing wind in close proximity to him. Ronnie was diagnosed as a violent schizophrenic and would be sent to Broadmoor Hospital, where he and Michael would be reunited in 1979, providing the latter with a much-needed friend when he first arrived at the psychiatric hospital. Meanwhile, back on C Wing at Parkhurst, the relaxed approach taken by the guards and new friendships he had formed could not prevent Michael from being riled up. Firstly, a guard upset him, prompting Michael to shove him against the wall and spit in his face, and warned the man he would kill him if he crossed him again. This assault led to Michael being placed on the hospital wing, where he came face to face with the inmates he despised the most, those convicted of sex offences. His resentment at this situation started him off on a plot to attack one of them, but before he could act, he was transferred out of the prison. He would find himself back at Wandsworth, a prison which, like Parkhurst, became a familiar sight as he was shipped from one institution to the next, sometimes being moved over 12 times in a single year. Yet every time he ended up at Wandsworth Prison, he would be placed in cell 13 on the punishment block, which gave him some small semblance of stability in what was otherwise akin to a game of musical chairs, with him being unable to settle into any facility for long before he would be shipped off again. During his return in 1976, the governor advised that Michael would be on the punishment block for a month, after which, depending on his behaviour, he would be moved to D Wing, which housed individuals serving 5 or more years. Michael proved himself and was granted the move to the wing, where he was expected to work in the sewing room, which, as stated before, he found emasculating. He also found it hard to adapt to life amongst the general prison population, showing signs he had become accustomed to solitary confinement. The noise and constant feeling of being watched unnerved him, to the point he decided he would attempt to escape. He concocted an idea that he would dig through the external cell wall, scale the outer prison defences and take a driver hostage to make his getaway. But before he had barely made a dint in the decaying stone, his activities were witnessed by another inmate, who informed the guards. Now considered an escape risk as well as being dangerous, he was placed back in the punishment block, had a further 4 months added to his term, and would remain under close scrutiny upon his return to D Wing. where he would encounter the man who had informed on him. While Michael resisted the urge to strike the man while waiting in the dinner queue, the prisoner would later be found in his cell with a large cut to his face. He claimed that he'd been attacked by someone wearing a pillowcase over their head. Michael would later suggest in his book Bronson that the injuries were self-inflicted, stating, "It's terrible what some people will do for attention." However, despite Michael denying any involvement, the prison officials may have suspected otherwise, as they placed him back in solitary, and it was here he would learn that his paternal grandfather had passed away following an explosion at his home. This, combined with the mental toll of isolation, caused him to withdraw, as he fell into a depressed state. He grew paranoid, believing people were watching and talking about him. He even tried to attack the prison doctor who had come to assess him, but Michael was restrained before he could do any harm. Despite his declining mental state, the carousel of prison transfers continued, much to his disdain, especially when he was transported 220 miles north from Wandsworth to Walton, where he was housed in the punishment block for just 3 days before being escorted back to Wandsworth. All this done under the watchful eye of at least 7 guards at a time. This decision not only angered Michael but also confused the governor of Wandsworth, who sought answers why it had occurred, only to learn that Michael's reputation was now preceding him, and prisons were unwilling to house him, not only because of his violent nature, but they lacked the staff required to cover the compulsory 7-person guard he required. After weeks of trying to place the unwanted prisoner, only one facility was willing to take him back. He would return by ferry to Parkhurst, where he found himself back on C Unit. Michael's time back at Parkhurst would again prove eventful. He almost caused a riot on the wing after attacking a guard while leaving the recess. While prison officers were able to defuse the situation, Michael would be forcibly restrained and taken to the punishment wing, where he was thrown into a cell and beaten before they left him alone, bleeding and bruised. The moment the door of the cell was opened again, he threw the contents of his bedpan over the guard, only extending his stay in solitary. After this, every attempt to interact with him, either by guards, the governor, or the prison doctor, was met with a barrage of profanities, with him spiralling deeper into a manic state. Believing he was having a nervous breakdown, the prison brought in forensic psychiatrist Dr. Falk, who diagnosed Michael as being paranoid with psychopathic tendencies, while a neurologist would state he was inflicted with hysteria and epilepsy. His mental state may have been impacted by many factors, from the prolonged periods of isolation, the brutality he suffered at the hands of the guards, and the loss of connections with those on the outside. He may also have been negatively affected by the fact that it was now 1978, the year in which, had he demonstrated good behaviour, he would likely have walked free from prison. Yet his own actions had condemned him to a longer sentence. For Michael, 1978 would see him hit rock bottom. He found himself unable to control his aggression, becoming increasingly unpredictable, and would lash out over what many would see as the smallest slight. The most notable being the attack he carried out on fellow inmate Johnny O'Rourke. Although O'Rourke had antagonised a number of inmates on the wing, it would be Michael who would take action. He had lent Johnny a mop and a broom on multiple occasions, but each time his kindness was repaid by them not being returned, and Michael being forced to ask for them back. Each time he was given them back, along with an apology that became increasingly meaningless, much to Michael's annoyance, which overflowed into a moment of pent-up rage. He entered O'Rourke's cell and began to strike him numerous times in the face with a jam jar, his victim crawling under the bed in an attempt to get away, with his arms and legs becoming the targets for Michael's aggression. As had occurred following previous incidents, Michael was stripped of his clothing, placed in a cell on the punishment block, and although he had managed to conquer the intrusive thoughts before, that night he found it impossible to control the overwhelming feelings of emptiness and despair that took over him. Feeling like he had no control over his life and unable to keep the invasive thoughts away, Michael attempted to cut his wrists, Passing out from the blood loss, he was fortunate that a guard checked on him in time to save his life. He would be treated for his injuries on the hospital wing, charged with grievous bodily harm in relation to O'Rourke, yet his suicide attempt seemed to have been overlooked, with no help or counselling offered. In the weeks that followed, Michael's mental state became a source of increasing concern. In particular, on the day he was due a visit from his relatives, he became agitated, speaking harshly to a guard who had opened the hatch of his cell door, and when the door was opened to serve him breakfast, he slashed the guard's face. This landed Michael back in the punishment cell, having been stripped and beaten, with his relatives being informed that due to his actions they would not be able to see him. As his heartbroken family made the long journey home, questions began to be raised regarding whether he was of sound mind, with Michael being placed on antidepressants. Michael appeared at Newport Crown Court to determine whether he was fit to stand trial for the attack on O'Rourke, after being assessed by Dr. Fulk from the Home Office, Dr. Cooper, Parkhurst's medical officer, and Dr. Tidmarsh from Broadmoor. The three medical professionals deemed Michael was unfit to plead. Although they failed to agree on a diagnosis, they did conclude that he was not of sound mind and should be sectioned under the Mental Health Act. This decision meant that he was to be held for an undetermined period at a secure hospital. He left the prison confines as an inmate to become a patient at Rampton Hospital in Nottinghamshire. Michael would be taken to the facility on the 8th of December 1978, accompanied by 7 prison guards and greeted by half a dozen psychiatric nurses. Repeating what had occurred during his multiple prison transfers, Michael reacted violently and had to be forcibly restrained in order to be taken to the ward, where he was stripped, bathed and then left naked in a room. Michael would come to view these rooms as being akin to a prison cell, and the nurses as prison officers in white coats. This impression formed from the treatment he received during his 11-month stay at the hospital. When he became defiant, he was beaten. When he refused to take his medication, he would be forcibly injected with a concoction of drugs which rendered him sedate and compliant. His limbs would stiffen, he gained weight and was unable to speak. For his first 3 months at Rampton, he was held on an assessment wing with 29 other patients, which made Michael uneasy when he learned that the majority of them had committed sexually motivated murders, rapes, or were child killers. In terms of the prison population, these individuals were considered the lowest of the law, and Michael shared that opinion. One such patient was John White, who had been responsible for the rape and murder of a young girl, and he drew the wrath of Michael, who believed that killing White would not only rid the world of such an individual, but would force his return to the prison system. The attack would take place in the ward's day room, where White was sat watching the television. Aware he was under close supervision, Michael positioned himself on a chair behind his intended target, in a location that allowed him a clear view of the 2 nurses, who were both reading and occasionally glanced up to check on the patients. As their eyes returned to the books, Michael seized his opportunity. Pulling out a tie he had concealed, he drew it tight around White's neck and held it as his victim turned blue, his eyes bulging and his body shaking. By this time, nurses had pushed forward to halt the attack, a task which took immense effort, as they grabbed, punched and clawed at Michael in an attempt to release his grip. When Michael was finally torn away, he was akin to a wild animal, screaming, biting and lashing out, mixed with fits of laughter as he was dragged off to a cell and injected. Once under sedation, Michael was taken to the intensive care wing, where he would reside in an isolation cell for 3 weeks, with just a mattress on the floor to sleep on. Nothing was allowed in or out of the room, which he could potentially use to harm himself or others, meaning meals were served on paper plates, drinks in cardboard cups, his bedpan was brought only when he asked for it, and it was removed straight away. His morning shave was also carried out by a nurse while Michael was seated in a chair. To add to the indignity of the situation, he was denied the right to read or write his own letters, with everything having to be dictated through the hatch in the door. Given Michael's actions while in the assessment wing, with it being decided that he was not mentally fit to stand trial for the attack on White, Michael was placed on the Drake Intensive Care Unit, a wing designed to house 15 of the most dangerous, disturbed or unpredictable patients who required close supervision. This designation meant that all visits, which for other patients took place in the central hall, would take place on the wing, with at least 2 nurses standing by the door in anticipation of trouble. For 11 months he remained at Rampton under constant supervision, spending half of his stay in isolation and showing no signs of any improvement in his mental state, which prompted the hospital's medical officer to determine that there was no further treatment they could provide, with the decision being made that he should be sent to Broadmoor Hospital. On the 20th of November 1979, Michael was loaded into a secure van to be transported 170 miles south to the infamous psychiatric hospital, which has housed some of the most disturbed and despicable individuals in British criminal history. 5 years earlier he had entered the prison system, having committed a number of serious offences, and his actions both inside and out of prison having implications for all those involved, from his loved ones to those he had caused serious physical and mental trauma to. This includes the people he has held at gunpoint during his robberies, to the guards and prisoners he has assaulted. And while there are those who believe some of them deserved it, one must remember that Michael's actions were often driven by rage, revenge, or a sudden impulse. During those initial 5 years, Michael Peterson, whose violent actions cannot be condoned due to the harm and suffering he has caused others, also endured relentless beatings, humiliation, and prolonged stays in isolation, which only fueled his resentment and rage. On many occasions he opted to fight back, instead of being compliant, and this defiant attitude only led to his prison term being increased, along with ever harsher treatment by the prison system. From the guards who beat him to the days spent alone in cells deprived of sunlight, conversation and civility. Michael was also moved constantly between prisons, which denied him a sense of stability and made it difficult for his loved ones to visit him, many times due to these transfers taking place without prior notice at any time, day or night, with him often being placed in facilities hundreds of miles away from where his family resided. Throughout the accounts relating to the events that occurred during his early years in the prison system, one gets a sense that his actions swung between being unpredictable to premeditated, sometimes exploding into a sudden burst of aggression, while on other occasions he was patient, willing to wait weeks or months, biding his time and planning how he will proceed, making it hard for those in control of the prisons to trust him. While his ever-increasing prison sentence in those early years can be put down to his actions, there is also another side to the story. Michael could be considered a prime example of the detrimental effects a system that punishes without rehabilitation can have on an individual, and how this may have led to him being placed inside Britain's most infamous psychiatric hospital. Join me next time as we go behind the walls of Broadmoor. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.
Hey, it's Ryan Seacrest. Life comes at you fast, which is why it's important to find some time to relax. A little you time. Enter Chumba Casino. With no download required, you can jump on anytime, anywhere for the chance to redeem some serious prizes. So treat yourself with Chumba Casino and play over 100 online casino-style games, all for free. Go to ChumbaCasino.com to collect your free welcome bonus. Sponsored by Chumba Casino. No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus terms and conditions apply.